Okay, I want to read a little bit of a really good series on the quote unquote Spanish flu that I came across. This is titled, Did a Vaccine Experiment on US Soldiers Cause the Spanish Flu? The 1918 to 1919 bacterial vaccine experiment may have killed 500 to 100 million people. Now, before getting started, if you're like me and you went to school in the American public education system, you will remember being taught about the Spanish flu during World War I and how it killed many, many people. So let's see if what they taught us in school is correct. This is part one of a five-part series by Kevin Barry. The Spanish flu killed an estimated 500 to 100 million people during a pandemic in 1918 to 1919. What if the story we have been told about this pandemic isn't true? What if, instead, the killer infection was neither the flu nor Spanish in origin? Newly analyzed documents reveal that the Spanish flu may have been a military vaccine experiment gone awry. In looking back on the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, we need to delve deeper to solve this mystery. During the pandemic of 1918-19, the so-called Spanish flu killed 500 to 100 million people, including many soldiers. Many people do not realize that disease killed far more soldiers on all sides than machine guns or mustard gas or anything else typically associated with World War I. Why is what happened 100 years ago important now? Between 1900 to 1920, there were enormous efforts underway in the industrialized world to build a better society. Well, of course, that is completely debatable if we take a larger view of what civilization is, what society is, and what these cities are designed to do, which is herd people into an environment that is completely unnatural and has the effect of disconnecting us from our natural design. But that's neither here nor there. Let's just focus on this little case study. Pharmaceutical. In the late 19th century through the early 20th century, New York became the home of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now Rockefeller University. The institute is where the modern pharmaceutical industry was born. The institute pioneered many of the approaches the pharmaceutical industry uses today, including the preparation of vaccine serums for better or worse. The vaccine used in the Fort Riley experiment on soldiers was made in horses. U.S. mortality rates data from the turn of the 20th century to 1965 clearly indicates that clean water, flushing toilets, effective sewer systems, and refrigerated foods all combined to effectively reduce mortality from infectious diseases before vaccines for those diseases became available. Have doctors and the pharmaceutical manufacturers taken credit for reducing mortality from infectious disease, which rightfully belongs to sandhogs, plumbers, electricians, and engineers? If hubris at the Rockefeller Institute in 1918 led to a pandemic disease which killed millions of people, what lessons can we learn and apply to 2018? Now, of course, the person that wrote this article is an attorney, and they're doing a bit of public relations in the way that they are classifying all of these issues. And it's pretty clever because it's trying to put it in the context of the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause as a way that this could eventually be taken to the Supreme Court of the United States and create a precedent for people to decline vaccines on First Amendment grounds. But as a result of using that sort of tactic, they can't be fully honest about what's going on here. But of course, if you're listening to this, you know all about the Rockefellers, and we're not going with the coincidence theory of history that this was some sort of coincidence that the Rockefeller Institute was behind this vaccine that eventually led to the quote-unquote Spanish flu right as World War I was going on, and all of these soldiers from the United States would eventually be traveling to Europe and spreading this disease. So anyway, moving on. The disease was not Spanish. While watching an episode of American Experience on PBS a few months ago, I was surprised to hear that the first cases of Spanish flu occurred at Fort Riley, Kansas in 1918. I thought, how is it possible this historically important event could be so badly misnamed 100 years ago and never corrected? Why Spanish? Spain was one of a few countries not involved in World War I. Most of the countries involved in the war censored their press. Free from censorship concerns, the earliest press reports of people dying from disease in large numbers came from Spain. The warring countries did not want to additionally frighten the troops, so they were content to scapegoat Spain. Soldiers on all sides would be asked to cross no man's land into machine gun fire, which was frightening enough without knowing that the trenches were a disease breeding ground. 100 years later, it's long past time to drop Spanish from all discussion of this pandemic. If the flu started at a United States military base in Kansas, then the disease could and should be more aptly named. In order to prevent future disasters, the US and the rest of the world must take a hard look at what really caused the pandemic. It is possible that one of the reasons the Spanish flu has never been corrected is that it helps disguise the origin of the pandemic. Yeah, it's possible, right? In quotes. Yes, of course, this is why it has not been clarified. If the origin of the pandemic involved a vaccine experiment on US soldiers, then the US may prefer calling it Spanish flu instead of the Fort Riley bacteria of 1918 or something similar. The Spanish flu started at the location this experimental bacterial vaccine was given, making it the prime suspect as the source of the bacterial infections which killed so many. It would be much more difficult to maintain the marketing mantra of vaccines save lives if a vaccine experiment originating in the United States during the years of primitive manufacturing caused the deaths of 500 to 100 million people. Vaccines save lives, except we may have killed 500 to 100 million people in 1918-19, is a far less effective sales slogan than the overly simplistic vaccines save lives. The disease which killed so many was not flu or a virus, it was bacterial. During the mid-2000s, there was much talk about pandemic preparedness. Influenza vaccine manufacturers in the United States received billions of taxpayer dollars to develop vaccines to make sure that we don't have another lethal pandemic flu like the one in 1918-19. And it's interesting, right, that in the mid-2000s, there was all that bird flu, H1N1 swine flu, and all of the vaccines that were being developed to combat that stuff. And we'll see as we go through this article why that is so interesting in the context of this quote-unquote Spanish flu. Capitalizing on the flu part of Spanish flu helped vaccine manufacturers procure billion-dollar checks from governments, even though scientists knew at the time that bacterial pneumonia was the real killer. It is not my opinion that bacterial pneumonia was the real killer. Thousands of autopsies confirm this fact. According to a 2008 National Institute of Health paper, bacterial pneumonia was the killer in a minimum of 92.7% of the 1918-19 autopsies reviewed. It is likely higher than 92.7%. The researchers looked at more than 9,000 autopsies, and there were no negative bacterial lung culture results. And this is a quote from the study. In the 68 higher quality autopsy series, in which the possibility of unreported negative cultures could be excluded, 92.7% of autopsy lung cultures were positive for bacterium. In one study of approximately 9,000 subjects who were followed from clinical presentation with influenza to resolution or autopsy, researchers obtained with sterile technique cultures of either pneumococci or streptococci from 164 of 167 lung tissue samples. There were 89 pure cultures of pneumococci, 19 cultures, oh, this is kind of blah, blah, blah. Anyway, there were no negative lung culture results, so pneumococci or streptococci were found in 164 of the 167 lung tissue samples autopsied. That is 98.2% bacteria was the killer. Where did the Spanish flu bacterial pneumonia of 1918-19 originate? When the United States declared war in April 1917, the fledgling pharmaceutical industry had something they had never had before: a large supply of human test subjects in the form of the U.S. military's first draft. Pre-war in 1917, the U.S. Army was 286,000 men. Post-war in 1920, the U.S. Army disbanded and had 296,000 men. During the war years 1918 to 1919, the U.S. Army ballooned to 6 million men, with 2 million men being sent overseas. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research took advantage of this new pool of human guinea pigs to conduct vaccine experiments. Between January 21st and June 4th of 1918, Dr. Gates, now this is someone who worked at the Rockefeller Institute. Dr. Gates reports on an experiment where soldiers were given 3 doses of a bacterial meningitis vaccine. Those conducting the experiment on soldiers were just spitballing dosages of a vaccine serum made in horses. The vaccination regime was designed to be 3 doses. 5,000 men received the first dose, but only 4,257 got the second dose, down 11%, and only 3,702 received all 3 doses, down 22.7%. A total of 1,090 men were not there for the 3rd dose. What happened to these soldiers? Were they shipped east by train from Kansas to board a ship to Europe? Were they in Fort Riley Hospital? Dr. Gates' report doesn't tell us. An article accompanying the American Experience broadcast I watched shed some light on where these 1,090 men might be. Gates began his experiments in January 1918. By March of that year, 100 men a day were entering the infirmary at Fort Riley. Are some of these men missing from Dr. Gates' report, the ones who did not get the 2nd or 3rd dose? Shortly before breakfast on Monday, March 11th, the first domino would fall, signaling the commencement of the first wave of the 1918 influenza. Company cook Albert Gitchell reported to the camp infirmary with complaints of a bad cold. Right behind him came Corporal Lee W. Drake voicing similar complaints. By noon, Camp Surgeon Edward R. Schreiner had over 100 sick men on his hands, all apparently suffering from the same malady. Gates does report that several of the men in the experiment had flu-like symptoms, coughs, vomiting, and diarrhea after receiving the vaccine. These symptoms are a disaster for men living in barracks, traveling on trains to the Atlantic coast, sailing to Europe, and living and fighting in trenches. The unsanitary conditions at each step of the journey are an ideal environment for a contagious disease like bacterial pneumonia to spread. According to Gates, they injected random dosages of an experimental bacterial meningitis vaccine into soldiers. Afterwards, some of the soldiers had symptoms which simulated meningitis, but Dr. Gates advances the fantastical claim that it wasn't actual meningitis. The soldiers developed flu-like symptoms. Bacterial meningitis then and now is known to mimic flu-like symptoms. Perhaps the similarity of early symptoms of bacterial meningitis and bacterial pneumonia to symptoms of flu is why the vaccine experiments at Fort Riley have been able to escape scrutiny as a potential cause of the Spanish flu for 100 years and counting. How did the Spanish flu spread so widely so quickly? There is an element of a perfect storm in how the Gates bacteria spread. Yes, of course. World War I ended only 10 months after the first injections. Unfortunately for the 500 to 100 million who died, those soldiers injected with horse-infused bacteria moved quickly during those 10 months. An article from 2008 on the CDC's website describes how sick World War I soldiers could pass along the bacteria to others by becoming cloud adults. Finally, for brief periods and to varying degrees, affected hosts became cloud adults who increased the aerolization of colonizing strains of bacteria, particularly pneumococci. I'm not even going to try to read the rest of this. For several days during local epidemics, particularly in crowded settings such as hospital wards, military camps, troop ships, and mines, and trenches, some persons were immunologically susceptible to infected with or recovering from infections with influenza virus. Persons with active infections were aerolizing the bacteria that colonize their noses and throats, while others, often in the same breathing spaces, were profoundly susceptible to invasion of and rapid spread through their lungs by their own or others' colonizing bacteria. So this is a massive coincidence, right? That just as World War I was headed to an end, these infected soldiers were spreading this vaccine-induced disease to the entire world at that point, really, or at least the entire Western world. 3 times in his report on the Fort Riley vaccine experiment, Dr. Gates states that some soldiers had a severe reaction indicating an unusual individual susceptibility to the vaccine. While the vaccine made many sick, it only killed those who were susceptible to it. Those who became sick and survived became cloud adults who spread the bacteria to others, which created more cloud adults, spreading to others where it killed the susceptible, repeating the cycle until there were no longer wartime unsanitary conditions and there were no longer millions of soldiers to experiment on. Now, that's so fascinating, right, in the way that the official vaccine propaganda talks about herd immunity, right? Oh, yes, this establishes a herd immunity, and it's essentially describing this process. But of course, the entire vaccine thesis is born out of eugenics and all the usual players in the eugenics movement, which is basically funneled through from the Royal Society in Britain. The toll on U.S. troops was enormous, and it is well documented. Dr. Carol Beverly describes how the influenza traveled like wildfire through the U.S. military. And he says substitute bacteria for influenza or virus in these quotes. I'm not actually going to read the quote, but I'll link the article and you can read it for yourself and do that. The United States was not the only country in possession of the Rockefeller Institute's experimental bacterial vaccine. A 1919 report from the Institute states, reference should be made that before the United States entered the war in April 1917, the Institute had resumed the preparation of anti-meningococcal serum in order to meet the requests of England, France, Belgium, Italy, and other countries. The same report states, in order to meet the suddenly increased demand for the curative serums worked out at the Institute, a special stable for horses was quickly erected. An experimental anti-meningococcal serum made in horses and injected into soldiers who would be entering the cramped and unsanitary living conditions of war. What could possibly go wrong? Is the bacterial serum made in horses at the Rockefeller Institute, which was injected into U.S. soldiers and distributed to numerous other countries, responsible for the 500 to 100 million people killed by bacterial lung infections in 1918 to 1919. The Institute says it distributed the bacterial serum to England, France, Belgium, Italy, and other countries during World War I. Not enough is known about how these countries experimented on their soldiers. I hope independent researchers will take an honest look at these questions. Before going forward, in part 2 of this series, the author looks at the actual process that was going on as far as developing the serum from horses, and I want to read a little bit of this. In part 1, I asked if medical products made in horses may have played a role in the new disease which killed millions worldwide in the pandemic of 1918-19. The December 1917 issue of Popular Mechanics magazine sheds light on the vaccine manufacturing process of 100 years ago. The feature article, How New York City's Health Department Makes Serums and Vaccines for the United States Army, describes processes in place in 1917. After the horse has been inoculated with the disease poison in gradually increasing doses, he is bled and his serum is found to be antitoxin. This is administered to human beings and renders them immune to the disease. Some horses give more antitoxic serum than others. The same horse may be used at several different times for the preparation of distinctly different antitoxins. Horses are used in the preparation of diphtheria, tetanus antitoxin, and anti-meningococcal serum. It is difficult to believe that they used these same horses to make multiple disease serums, but they did. If safety had been a concern, perhaps certain horses would have been dedicated to producing serum for one disease, or poison as the article calls it, but safety does not appear to be on the list of concerns. These muddled and potentially contaminated serums were then given to soldiers and to the public. Species jump. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier when I made that brief mention of what we all were subjected to as far as the propaganda of, swine flu, bird flu, H1N1, and all the other various fear-mongering that goes on in the media whenever one of these things happens. And then after the fear-mongering, of course, the requisite drive to have you get immunized, quote-unquote, to these various pathogens. So species jump. Were pathogens transferred from these horses to humans in mass quantities in ways they had never transferred before? Humans and horses had interacted closely for centuries, but horse serum had not been injected into humans in that way before. Of course not, because it's not natural, bypassing the human immune system. Is it possible that this new method of exposure caused the bacterial pneumonias which ripped human lungs apart in ways never before seen? Could pathogens relatively harmless to horse lungs make a species jump and destroy human lungs? In 1919, a Dutch military veterinarian named Captain Emil Bemelmans developed an extensive theory on the relation between human and animal influenza. In 1919, he argued that the human flu and the so-called infectious disease of the breast of horses are exactly identical in etological, bacteriological, and epidemiological senses. So I'm not going to read the rest of this, but Dr. Bemelman's contemporaneous observations have largely been lost to history, in part because of the self-important attitude of the medical community. The hubris of the medical community prevented them from listening to a lowly veterinarian. However, Dr. Bemelman's observations and persistence in getting them published are extraordinarily valuable. His awareness at the time that bacteria was the killer of both humans and horses in the pandemic of 1918-19 put him decades ahead of his contemporaries. The NIH paper describing bacteria as the predominant killer of the quote-unquote Spanish flu was published in 2008. If Dr. Bemelmans was correct that horses and humans were suffering from an identical disease, are their diseases identical or very similar in horses and humans? Do any of those diseases target the lungs? And then, of course, this is a 1969 paper. Kansas State University veterinarian Dr. Cornelius compiled a list of diseases which were very similar or identical in humans and various other species. Among the diseases identical, very similar in humans and horses is pulmonary emphysema, which targets the lungs. So the question is, did a pathogen which causes pulmonary emphysema species jump from horses to humans in these serums and vaccines? The vaccines were obviously manufactured in primitive, unavoidably unsafe conditions and then given to World War I soldiers as an experiment. What exactly was in the serums and vaccines made in the horses at the Rockefeller Institute? Especially considering that the same individual horses were used for a variety of serums for multiple diseases. Recall from part 1 that streptococci bacteria were commonly found in the tissue samples from the autopsies of those who died in 1918-19. Cornelius said human and horse pulmonary emphysema are identical. Bemelmans reported that humans and horses were suffering from the same disease. Did doctors treating soldiers suffering from Spanish flu, quote unquote, report on encountering a new killer type of pulmonary emphysema causing lung damage they had never seen before? Captain Dr. Torrey served at Camp Hancock just outside of Augusta, Georgia. The soldiers who came through Camp Hancock were likely on their way to Charleston, South Carolina to board ships to France, but many of them would not survive to get to the front. Thousands died at Camp Hancock. Some who survived the illness likely made it to the ships, potentially passing the infectious bacteria to other soldiers in the unsanitary conditions which were rampant during World War I. And then this is Dr. Torrey's report, where he goes on to note that the pulmonary emphysema Well, let's see. Torrey describes what happened to these soldiers as they died. They were coughing, becoming cloud adults, as described in part 1. It looked like a bacterial infection to him. So this doctor that was exposed to the infection is noting that it looked like a bacterial infection to him. Fluid in the lungs strangled the human victims of Spanish flu. There is a highly contagious horse respiratory infection called strangles or distemper. If this disease can kill horses, what would it do to human beings if introduced into humans via injection and therefore bypassing the immune system on a mass scale? Strangles is a highly contagious upper respiratory infection of horses caused by the bacteria Streptococcus equi, subspecies equi. It is transmitted by inhalation or direct contact with contaminated surfaces, for example, horses sharing water buckets. So the question, of course, is, did Streptococcus equi contaminate the serums and vaccines made in horses produced at the Rockefeller Institute and injected into soldiers in a vaccine experiment? Was Streptococcus equi in the medical serums given to the soldiers as treatments? Was it some other pathogen which species jumped? So you see the dots that are being connected very well here, that this is obviously what most likely happened, that this horse respiratory infection was injected directly into human beings, and there was a species jump that occurred where this horse infection then began to obliterate human lungs, and this was later said to have been some pandemic flu, when in reality it was an actual bacterial infection that was transferred directly through the vaccines themselves. It wasn't some random flu that emerged out of nowhere, and it wasn't, it wasn't some accident, of course, in light of the fact that this all happened right as World War I was going on, and all of these soldiers would eventually carry this infection overseas, and it would eventually kill over 100 million people, which was way more than were killed during the actual war itself. And then this part goes on to note how, well, back in part one where he was saying, the military ballooned to 6 million men. This was a huge increase in the amount of test subjects available. And then this part goes on to note how the vaccine industry is always looking for human test subjects. So let's see, going back to part two. Oh yeah, then he goes over this Dr. Plotkin, who was heavily involved in the vaccination world, and he was deposed in January 2018. And I believe there's a couple quotes in part one. Yeah, and he wrote, "The question is whether we are to have experiments performed on fully functioning adults and on children who are potentially contributors to society, or to perform initial studies in children and adults who are human in form but not in social potential." So that's eugenics right there, right? That is a mantra for eugenics. But you can see why the vaccine schedule has changed over the years to now where they are giving so many more vaccines to infants, where they are the definition of a population that is unable to refuse. And it's totally on their parents to know what's going on to refuse for them, right? I mean, so it's a complete experiment on the general population. There's no telling what's in these vaccines. I mean, we're just talking like, things that could be species transferred from cows or pigs or whatever they're using as the cultures for the serum, which could have all kinds of crazy effects when, totally bypassing the immune system and the blood-brain barrier and all that stuff, placed directly into the bloodstream. I mean, the effects could be, there's no way to know. And on top of that, who knows what's in it above these animal serums, right? I mean, there could be all kinds of stuff in there that isn't on any labels, right? In addition to all the adjuvants that are in there, and the formaldehyde and mercury and all that. So this is we'll finish with this. In 1918-19, the vaccine industry experimented on soldiers, likely with disastrous results. In 2018, the vaccine industry experiments on infants every day. The vaccine schedule has never been tested as it is given. The results of the experiment are in 1 in 7 American children is in some form of special education, and over 50% have some form of chronic illness. Wow. In 1918-19, there was no safety follow-up after vaccines were delivered. In 2018, there is virtually no safety follow-up after a vaccine is delivered. Who exactly gave you that flu shot at Rite Aid? Do you have the cell number of the store employee if something goes wrong? In 1918 and 19, there was no liability to the manufacturer for injuries or death caused by vaccines. In 2018, there is no liability for vaccine manufacturers for injuries or death caused by vaccines, which was formalized in 1986. And this, of course, is referring to the fact that, as you all probably know, the vaccines are legally classified as unavoidably unsafe. Like literally, the propaganda is so strong that they have convinced the general population to inject something into their body that is unavoidably unsafe due to this misguided interpretation of what is actually going on, right? So they're literally telling you that it's unavoidably unsafe. And so legally, as a result, they have established this precedent that the vaccine manufacturers, the multinational billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies, are immune from prosecution and being sued civilly, and every claim has to go through the special tribunal, I want to say, that they set up to where all the complaints can be levied, and then it's this ridiculous process where sometimes people are actually rewarded for vaccine-induced damage, but because it's unavoidably unsafe and there's very little oversight and there's so many disclaimers, there's hardly ever any recourse given through this process. And just the overall takeaway is that these companies are immune from prosecution for a reason, because there's something very sketchy going on in this industry. So all that aside, really interesting article on the potential origins of what is referred to as the Spanish flu. And it really makes you wonder if the research here is correct, that the actual Spanish flu itself was really the result of a species jump bacterial infection from horses to humans as a result of horse serum vaccines being injected directly into the bloodstream of unsuspecting soldiers. Well, it makes you wonder about the larger vaccine agenda in general, because the term itself, vaccine, comes from the Latin vacca, which means cow, because some of the original vaccines produced by Jenner were not horse serum, but they were cow serum. They were using the same process, just with cows. And you have to wonder, how many of the quote-unquote diseases that we are subject to were actually the same sort of thing, a species jump from cows that produced some sort of disease in humans. And then later, how many of them are pointed to later as an excuse for more vaccines, right? Which just continues this insane process where we are continually being injected with things that have no business being directly injected into the human body. And of course, going to the CDC website, what do they have to say about the 1918 influenza pandemic? Well, of course, predictably, they have nothing to say about anything that we just went over in that article. And indeed, they use it as a sales pitch to support their broader agenda. And it's a really crazy situation to find ourselves in. But one last thing I wanted to mention is that recently the FDA, just a few weeks ago, approved Vaxilis, which is a 6-in-1 combo vaccine for babies. On December 21st, 2018, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved a new combination hexavalent vaccine that includes antigens for 6 different diseases: diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, hepatitis B, poliomyelitis, and invasive Haemophilus influenza type B. Combination vaccines have been created by manufacturers to purportedly reduce the number of shots a child must receive to be in compliance with government-recommended childhood vaccine schedules, and to simplify ordering, blah, blah, blah. It's so interesting, right, how there's sort of this backlash happening to the idea that, well, hey, when I was a kid, for example, I didn't have to get very many vaccines. I got all of them. It was 6 or 7, I think. And now it's somewhere in the range of 60 to 70. And intuitively, subconsciously, it makes sense to people that there's no need for this, especially if you're going to give all of these to an infant, on some sort of schedule when they haven't even had a chance to develop their own immune system. Does it make sense to inject something into an undeveloped immune system like that and bypass everything right after they're born? No, of course it makes zero sense. So sort of in response to this now, these pharmaceutical companies are going to create 6-in-1 combo shots so that when the official statistics are out there, it'll be, oh, well, they actually only got 7 shots, but it was actually 40 immunizations, so it just, you can kind of see the path that is being laid out here of how they're going to kind of combat some of that other energy that's out there that is criticizing the vaccination process. So yeah, really interesting article, and I'll just leave it at that and talk to you soon.